There's a man who spent his whole life reading DNA, and one afternoon he decided to read his own name. His name was Sykes, an ordinary name. If you're from the north of England, you've met a few. It isn't a name that sounds like anything. No castle behind it, no coat of arms, no story your grandmother told by the fire. It's just a word. And that word, it turns out, is an old one. In Yorkshire, centuries ago, a Sykes was a boundary stream, a small ditch of running water at the edge of a field, marking where one man's land ended and another's began. So, somewhere back there, the very first Sykes was probably just the man who lived by the ditch. That should be the whole story. A plain word, a muddy field, a name handed down so many times that whatever meaning it once carried had worn off like paint on an old door. It's the kind of name you'd never think twice about. You write it on forms, you spell it out over the phone. You have never once wondered where it came from. Because why would you? It's just the sound people make when they mean you. But this man could do something almost no one in history has ever been able to do. He could open the name up, he could look inside it, and what he found in there was a person. Let me tell you what he did, because it's simpler than you'd think. Your last name travels down through the fathers, father to son, all the way back. And there's one piece of you that travels exactly the same way. A tiny thread of DNA, handed from father to son, almost perfectly unchanged, generation after generation. Think of it as a message copied by hand and passed down a line of scribes, except these scribes almost never make a mistake. The message goes down the centuries, nearly untouched. Two things riding the same river then, the name and the thread. So he wondered if he gathered up a crowd of men who all carried the name Sykes, complete strangers, men who had never met and never would they be carrying the same message too? He collected around 60 of them, 60 men named Sykes, scattered across the country, no known connection to one another. Different towns, different faces, men who, if you put them in a room, would have shaken hands like the strangers they believed they were. He read a handful of markers off each man's thread. Just a few spots, the way you might check 4 words in a long letter to see whether 2 copies came from the same original. And nearly half of those letters matched, not their whole DNA. Nobody was reading anyone's whole DNA. But at every marker he tested, nearly half of these strangers carried the same distinctive pattern. A pattern he could not find anywhere else in Britain, not in the surrounding towns, not in the country at large. It showed up in these men, and essentially nowhere else, which leaves one likely explanation, and when it lands, it doesn't land in your head. It lands somewhere lower than that. Those men were carrying a piece of the same ancestor. One man, one Sykes. Around 700 years ago, somebody stood by a stream at the edge of a field, and for the very first time was called by that word. And the word didn't die with him. It rode down through his sons, and their sons, through plague and war and famine and centuries of ordinary forgotten Tuesdays, until it arrived, still intact, inside a crowd of strangers who had no idea they were family. They'd been carrying a piece of him their whole lives. Not one of them knew. The scientist's name was Brian Sykes, and in that moment he wasn't looking at data anymore. He was looking at his own relatives. He'd gone hunting for a pattern, and instead he'd met his family, 7 centuries of them, folded up inside his own last name. Here's the part I keep coming back to. He was surprised. Everyone who studied these things had assumed a name like Sykes came from lots of different families, all grabbing the same handy word for a stream. They assumed it was a coincidence of language, a word that happened to catch on. It wasn't. Underneath a huge surviving branch of that name, there was a person. And the reason that matters to you, the reason this isn't just a story about one English family, is that the same door is sitting there in your name, right now, waiting for someone to open it. So let's walk through it. Because your last name is not random, it is not decoration, and it is not an accident. Across Britain and most of Europe, surnames began as plain descriptions of somebody real, And once you know the 4 doors those names came through, you will never hear your own the same way again. Some of us are named after our fathers. That is the oldest door. Johnson was, literally, John's son. Anderson, Anders's son. Every son on the planet is a small monument to a man whose actual first name you are still saying out loud, whether you speak English or not. The O in front of an Irish name, the Mac in front of a Scottish one, the Fitz in the old Norman families. All of them mean the same tender thing. Son of. You are walking around with your 10 times great-grandfather's first name stapled to the end of your own, and you never even noticed it was there. Some of us are named after our work. This door is my favorite, because when you open it, an entire medieval village comes back to life inside the sound. Smith was the one at the forge, hammering iron, the most common name in the English language, because every single village needed one. Baker at the oven, before the sun came up. Fletcher, feathering arrows by hand, one at a time. Cooper, bending wet wood into barrels. Archer with the bow. Mason cutting stone. Every one of those names is a person at their craft, frozen mid-motion, still working 900 years later every time somebody says the name out loud. And some of those trades do not even exist anymore. The world moved on and forgot them, but the name remembers. Somebody out there is carrying a job the world deleted, and their surname is the very last place on earth it survives. Some of us are named after a place, a hill, a wood, a brook. Somebody was simply the one from over there, and the patch of ground became the person. The person became a family, and the family, eventually, became you. Your name might be a lost address, directions to a piece of land your ancestors stood on and worked and left, that you have never seen and could not find on any map, and yet you carry the way there in your own name. And some of us are named for how we looked: short, white, for pale hair, strong. Somebody took one long look at a man 800 years ago and summed his whole self up in a single word, and that word outlived him and is still describing him today in your voice. 4 doors: father, work, place, person. And here is the quiet miracle sitting underneath all of it. In the whole of English history, there are only about 600 common first names. 600. But there are around 20,000 surnames, which means your last name is one of the most specific things ever attached to your bloodline. It is not a label somebody slapped on. It is a fingerprint that survived the centuries to reach you. And if you're sitting there thinking your name is one of the boring ones, too common, too plain, nothing special, hold on to that thought. Because plain is exactly what a name looks like after it's been worn smooth by 600 or 700 years of hands. The plainness isn't the absence of a story. The plainness is the story. It means the name worked. It got carried and carried and carried again by people who needed it enough to keep it alive all the way down to you. Now, those 4 doors are a European map, and the world is much bigger than Europe. Elsewhere, names come down from clans, from dynasties, from faith, from the mother's line, from a clerk at a border assigning something spellable, from an owner, from an official who simply decreed that everyone must choose one by spring. Some of those names were given with love, some were forced onto people, and some families chose a name on purpose, at a moment when choosing it meant something. Those are different doors. But every one of them still opens onto a person, and these names are older than you'd guess. For most of human history, people didn't have them at all. In a small village, one name was plenty. The very earliest we can put a date to belonged to an Irish family of historians, recorded before the year 916. A family whose job was to remember, and whose name became the thing that got remembered. Early on, names even wore small words in front. A man was John of the Hill, John the Smith. Over time, those little words fell away, worn smooth, until only the name was left. Just the name, the way you have it now. But a name is still only a word. What Brian Sykes showed is that the word is not traveling alone. Because here is where it goes deeper and stranger. The name and the thread ride the same river, down through the fathers, and how tightly they're bound depends on how rare the name is. Common names, the Smiths and the Joneses, had too many beginnings to trace. 100 different blacksmiths in 100 different villages, all landing on the same obvious word, but a rare name is far more likely to have kept one dominant line running through it. Not always. Even a rare name can have more than one beginning, and plenty do. But often enough that when you test one, you find a single person sitting underneath a great many of the men who carry it. And when they tested those rare names, some of the results were hard to believe. A few surnames showed more than 70 of every 100 men carrying the same pattern. Stop and think about what that had to survive. 700 years. The Black Death, which erased half of Europe. Wars that emptied entire counties. Wave after wave of newcomers washing over the country and blending in. And through all of it, straight down the line of fathers and sons, the thread held, barely frayed. One man's signature still refusing to disappear. The name, it turns out, is a time machine. And I don't mean that as a pretty phrase. I mean it works like an actual instrument. Gather the right rare surname, and you're suddenly looking at the living genetic map of a village that hasn't drawn breath in 800 years. You're reading the DNA of the dead through the bodies of people walking around today, ordering coffee, stuck in traffic, with no idea what they carry. And once scientists realized they could do that, they started finding things nobody was looking for. If your family has ever wondered where you really come from, if there's a name in your line whose story got lost somewhere, stay with me, because what these same tests turned up next is the part that made me go quiet and sit very still. And somewhere in the comments, tell me your last name and what you always believed it meant. I want to see how many of you are carrying a door you've never once opened. Because in that same British research on ordinary surnames, they came across one man. He was, by every visible measure, completely unremarkable. English, his paternal grandfather, born in Britain. A perfectly ordinary Yorkshire surname, the kind taken from a small local place, the kind still clustered today in the exact corner of England where it first appeared. If you'd passed him on the street, you'd have read his entire story in a single glance and never given it another thought. English name, English family, English man. Nothing to see. And then they looked at his thread. That thread, the piece that comes down the fathers, sits on an enormous family tree, one that holds every man who has ever lived. Every man alive is on it somewhere, out on some branch, and the branches join together as you travel down, the way twigs join to limbs, and limbs join to the trunk. Most European men sit up high, in the young outer branches, crowded in close together. This man did not. His thread belonged to one of the very oldest branches on the entire tree, a branch that splits away near the bottom, near the root, near the beginning of all of us. A lineage that traces back to West Africa. Sit with that for a second, because it's so much bigger than one man. Here is an ordinary Englishman with an ordinary English name, quietly carrying a thread that came out of Africa so long ago it branches off near the very base of the human male tree. There was no story about it in the family, no memory, nothing anyone could see in a mirror. It was simply there, inside him. Silent, the way it had been silent in his father, and every father before that, back into the fog where the records give out. And it wasn't only him. When they tested other men carrying his same rare surname, 7 of them had it too. 7 strangers. One name. One impossibly ancient thread running through all of them. And a shared grandfather of grandfathers somewhere back in Yorkshire, generations before anybody thought to write a single word of it down. Nobody knows the moment it entered the line. Maybe a man stepped off a ship. Maybe it was centuries earlier than anyone could guess. The written record simply runs out, and before that point there is only the thread itself, still quietly whispering an origin the family had completely forgotten. Until a stranger in a lab read it back to them, out loud, after all that time. That is what your last name is actually sitting on top of, not a flat little medieval label. A cable of inheritance so long and so unbelievably deep that the name, your name, 700 years old, 30 generations of fathers and sons, is only the last few inches of it. Because here is the true scale of the thing, and it is almost too big for a person to hold. That thread down the fathers does not stop at your medieval namesake. It does not stop in the Middle Ages at all. It keeps going, down and down and down, past every surname anyone has ever had, past the invention of writing, past the first farmers, past the paintings on the cave walls, to a single man who lived in Africa somewhere around 250,000 years ago. One man, from whom every living man on earth inherits that thread, through a line of fathers that has never, not even once, been broken in all that time. Your surname is maybe 30 links long. The chain it's clipped to the end of is closer to 10,000. 10,000 fathers. Try to picture the line of them. Stand your father behind you and his father behind him, and keep going, one man every step, stretching out of the room, out of the town, out past the edge of everything you know. You'd walk for miles down that line before you reached the first person who ever used your surname. And then you'd keep walking, for hundreds of miles more, past every one of them, before you reached the man at the very start of the thread. Every single one of them alive. Every single one of them yours. And every so often, one of those threads does something extraordinary. Scanning the DNA of thousands of men across Asia, geneticists kept running into lineages that had exploded. Threads that trace back to a single man, 1,000 or 2,000 years ago, and then turn up in millions of living descendants. A whole handful of them. Men whose sons and grandsons carried their thread across entire regions. And for most of them, we have no idea who they were. No name, no grave, no story. Just an enormous crowd of living people, all carrying a piece of one forgotten man. That's the thing about these threads. They're more honest than our stories are. They remember things we forgot on purpose, and they lose the things we were most certain of. Which brings me to the hardest part. The part nobody likes to say out loud. Because remember, nearly half the Sykes men carried that founder's pattern, but more than half of them did not. And that other half isn't a mistake, or an error in the science. It's the quiet truth of every family that has ever existed. Across 700 years, names get handed to stepsons. Children get raised and loved by men who didn't father them. A boy takes his mother's name, or a neighbor's, or a master's. Two brothers fall out, and one of them changes the spelling. A family lands in a new country, and the name gets rewritten at the desk. It happens in every line, at a low and steady rate, century after century, and it means the paperwork and the thread do not always tell the same story. So somewhere in your own line, the name and the blood may have quietly parted ways, and then found their way back together again, and no document anywhere on Earth recorded the moment it happened. An unbroken line of fathers. It's a beautiful phrase. But every family has a chapter the record couldn't see. The thread is real. It just isn't always the exact thread you'd assume. And this is the part I did not expect to find comforting. Because it means a family was never really about the biology in the first place. It was about the name being chosen, picked up, carried, handed forward on purpose, by people quietly deciding, this child is mine, and this name is yours now, so carry it. That is not a flaw in the story. That might be the single most human part of the whole thing. So think about your own name now, the one you write without even looking at your hand. The one printed on your coffee cup, sitting in your email, the one a teacher once called out from the top of a list while you waited to hear it. It isn't really yours. Not entirely. You're just the one who happens to be holding it right now. Somebody stood by a stream, or bent over a forge, or came walking down off a hill, and got called a single word, and then trusted, without any possible way of knowing, that the word would keep moving after they were gone. And it did. It moved through people who starved and people who ran, people who crossed oceans and people who never once left the valley they were born in. It moved through hands you will never shake, and faces you will never see, and every single one of them held it just long enough to pass it on to the next. And now, after all of that, it has arrived at you. Still intact, still spelling out, if you only know how to read it, exactly where you came from. Your last name is not a label, it's a message, and it has been traveling a very, very long time to reach you. Say it out loud sometime, really hear it, and know that you are the newest sound of something almost unimaginably old, and that one day you'll hand it forward too, into a future you'll never get to see, the same way it was once handed to you. Somebody's whole life is folded up inside that word, and it is still saying their name.